Drugs companies are often accused, are they not, of putting profits before people, turning vast profits at the expense of sick patients or cash-strapped governments. But is there another way? Welcome to Roundtable. Welcome to the programme. For me, David Foster. The UK's main opposition Labour Party wants a publicly owned medicines company to provide cheaper drugs. Big Pharma, that is the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry, has always argued that without high prices and profits, it won't be able to do life-saving work.
Soaring drug prices have always been an issue for low-income developing countries. But now wealthier nations are facing similar battles. Prescription drug prices in the US are the highest in the world. And close behind is Western Europe, where there's been public outrage and increased scrutiny. The UK's opposition party Labour has proposed a new policy it calls Medicines for the Many, pledging to create a publicly owned drugs manufacturer to make cheap generic versions of different medicines. It could change the way pharmaceutical research and development is funded. Other countries like India, Argentina and Brazil have already challenged patents and made affordable versions of drugs. Indian generic drug maker company Cipla offered a combination of drugs for AIDS at $350 a year per patient, less than $1 a day, compared to Western prices of between $10,000 and $15,000 a year. So could this limit patient choice, as pharmaceutical companies say, and lead to a lack of innovation? Or could it revolutionize the way we access key medicines and offer a real alternative to Big Pharma?
Time for me to introduce our guests on this roundtable. Joining us from the United States, Dr. Jing Luo from the University of Pittsburgh. Among his specialities, pharma economics. We go to the Netherlands. There is Jaysree Iyer, Executive Director of Access to Medicine International. With me in the studio, Heidi Chow, Senior Campaigns Manager at Global Justice Now, and Dr. Samir Nuseibeh, Senior Teaching Fellow at University College London. Well, welcome to each and every one of you. I'm going to start with you, Jay, because you work quite closely with the big pharma companies, and their argument's always been that money spent on research and development, they then bring in the profits. Without the profits, there would be no research. Is that a justified argument?
So that's true, that many of the pharmaceutical companies have said that without capital available for that comes from pharma spending, they would not be able to do research and development. I think that's somewhat the case, because we do have a model where the pharmaceutical industry is working with where revenue is being used to support research and development. And as the rising cost of research and development goes up, there's that puts a pressure back on the pharmaceutical companies. How much that puts a pressure? Does it justify the costs and the current prices? That's the part I think that we're going to be arguing and discussing today.
Absolutely. Dr. Jing, because it's always nice to go to people in our remote locations first. The argument is that, as I've said to Jay just now, without the profits they couldn't invest, but profits can in some cases be enormous, can't they?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, in the US, we call a blockbuster drug a brand name medicine that sells for over $1 billion per year. And, you know, we have several, if not dozens of examples of that just in the US market alone today. So profits can be large, and some people would argue that they're probably excessive, given the amount of innovation that we're truly seeing in the pharmaceutical market.
Okay, so both of you said some people would argue. Would you argue that the profits, Dr. Jing, are excessive?
Yeah, in many cases they probably are. You know, it's hard for a layperson to get a sense about how innovative or groundbreaking drugs truly are. But one of the advantages that I have is that I'm a physician by training, and I actually treat patients. If you're someone who works in the clinic or who works with patients directly, you can get a good sense of which medicines are truly innovative and groundbreaking discoveries, and which ones are Me Too drugs that, you know, they bring in a lot of money for the pharmaceutical industry, but to a large extent, they are not that innovative or groundbreaking.
Would it be fair to say, Samir and Heidi, that what Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the UK Labour Party, is talking about here is rip-off drugs. Basically, they take somebody else's formula, which may have gone through the patent time, or they could change the law to allow for that. But what they're doing is taking somebody else's work and putting their mark on it and selling it cheaply because they can imitate it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Firstly, I think Jeremy Corbyn does a fairly good job in this new initiative of his of setting out the case, and as we've just discussed, in terms of the prices that are being charged for these kind of drugs. And generics are drugs which are off patent, and Corbyn wants to target these kind of concepts to bring down the prices of drugs which are available to the NHS. But the problem with that is if you're going to attack the pharmaceutical industry and start sort of stealing their ideas and producing them for cheaper, that's going to have quite a lot of repercussions on the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm not quite sure about the legality.
Well, it could have quite a few repercussions on the people who are taking the drugs. They could live rather than die.
That's very true. I should say I do support this initiative before I say anything else, because the pricings are very, very expensive. But I just don't understand how just purely going for these generics is the solution and the way forward. I think Corbyn has essentially looked at the now and has perhaps tried to make some decisions that are going to aim towards the sort of electorate, I suppose, by saying we're going to offer cheaper drugs.
So you don't think it's practicable?
In the long run, no, I'm not sure it is.
Heidi, let me ask you this. Is there a middle ground here? Because we're talking about in India, they can now provide AIDS drugs for £1 a year. Some treatments elsewhere cost $100,000. I'm sorry, I don't know which it actually is, but a lot of money. So £1 versus 100,000. Is there a middle ground to be found here, rather than simply saying, you're ripping people off, we're going to do it a different way?
Yeah. I think when we look at Corbyn's proposals, so the headline-grabbing one was about the generics, public manufacturing of generic drugs, and I think that is definitely one of the solutions that I think would address some of the problems we're seeing in the generics market around drug shortages, around collusion between companies. There have been some really high-profile competition and markets authority cases where they have shown big pharmaceutical companies colluding to keep generics off the market in order to raise the prices.
The question of supply and demand. If
right.
there isn't enough there, then the price is going to go up because they're a rarity.
Exactly. So, for example,
you call them generics, I can call them rip-offs. The same thing.
But so I think there is an argument for a generics manufacturer, and because they are generics, as in they've come off patent, anyone can manufacture them. So there is a case for that, especially around shortages and around to tackle some of this collusive behaviour. But there's also a range of other parts of the Corbyn reforms in the medicines for the many proposals include as well changing natural incentives in the pharmaceutical industry. So, for example, at the moment, our innovation, we're paying for innovation very directly through high prices. So the pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to develop medicines because of the patent that they can get, which then sustains high prices. However, there's an obvious conflict, if you can see that, between high prices and patient access. Because actually, when you charge high prices, which is what you want for your shareholders, actually there's going to be a problem on the other side, because actually patients will struggle to access those medicines, whether you're in rich countries like the UK or poorer countries, low and middle income countries. Sorry, I was just trying to explain some of the changing the incentives part of the proposal, because I think that's probably been left out in some of the sort of big headlines that we see in the media. And changing incentives is really important, because we need to recognise that actually medicines aren't any other consumer good. They're not like designer handbags or designer trainers, you know, so you can't just walk away from a life-saving drug that could potentially lengthen your life, save your life, or change your life. And so I think there's a role for the government to play in taking a more public control of medicines.
What I wanted to put it up at this point, the drugs companies, as I said, argue that they put a lot of money into research and development. Yet here in the UK, I think I'm right in saying that this country, in terms of taxpayer money that goes into research and development, is number 2 in the world.
That's right.
It's not like the drugs companies do it all on their own.
That's right,
So I'm asking about a middle ground here.
Yeah, so at the moment, you're right, so the US is the largest country funder of research and development in the world. Number 2 is the UK. Actually, number 2 is the EU, but as a country funder, number two is the UK. So we pour billions of pounds into research and development. And what we find is that a lot of the public sector funding is funding the early stage basic science part of the drug development continuum.
So it's doing the hard initial work,
exactly.
and then somebody's picking it up and making money from it.
So we're doing, the public sector is funding kind of the riskier, the uncertain certain part of the process, the bit that really leads to genuine breakthroughs. Yeah. And then what happens is this research is then brought up by big pharmaceutical companies who then develop it, market it, and they spend more on marketing than they do on R&D. They spend more on buying back their own shares in R&D, and then they sell it back to the NHS, for example. So you have a situation where the taxpayer pays twice. First for the research and development, and then secondly through buying it through high prices.
But there is no need for this, is there not? Because there's something called the Compulsory Licensing Agreement, which came into force in 2001, I think, as part of the World Trade...
1995.
World Trade Talks. Well, it was signed off at the Doha Declaration, 2001. And that means that a country can say, we're taking over this drug, we're going to produce it, and we're going to give it to our people at a much, much cheaper rate. I'll go to you, Jay, first on this one. Other countries do it. Malaysia does it. Germany does it. And Britain used to do it. Why don't we now?
Well, I think for the last few years, the UK has had pretty good negotiations with the pharmaceutical industry on purchasing medicines. They've also had a significant amount of capital available to purchase medicines so far. I think they've always been a strong negotiator with the pharmaceutical industry, so they've gotten quite a large volume of medicines for a decent price. I think what we're facing now is a tipping point where some of the high prices are just so high that it's no longer sustainable for the UK to continue at the rate that it's going in order to purchase medicine. So there is a potential need to go into compulsory licensing. But there are alternatives.
But tell me why, if it's going to save lives, if it's going to be cheaper for the NHS, which is always short of money, which costs a fortune to run anyway, if the drugs were cheaper, it wouldn't cost so much. Why are they not doing it now?
I think that so far they're not doing it because there has been successful negotiations for medicines.
But not that successful that the drugs are really cheap. This is my point.
No, I think that there are success because you managed to purchase enough medicine to treat your patients. I think there is a middle ground where you can issue voluntary licenses, where you can encourage the pharmaceutical industry. It's something that we've been doing for over 10 years. There are mechanisms like the Medicines Patent Pool that have managed to create a whole spectrum of HIV medicines and bring them at low cost to multiple regions in the world. So there is always a need to look at voluntary licensing before one issues a compulsory licensing.
So do you agree with this idea that, in fact, governments in the UK, and let's say the UK government is in effect being blackmailed by pharmaceutical companies saying, we won't produce enough of this drug unless you give us reasonable terms? You said they've been able to purchase enough, presumably, to get by.
Yeah.
The drugs companies could make as much as they like and basically unload them on the NHS, couldn't they?
That's true. And so the very threat of having a compulsory license is already enough sometimes to ensure that companies negotiate and drop their prices to a certain degree, which is then affordable. But I think that what's really important is when negotiations with patent owners fail, that's when compulsory licenses have to be issued.
Okay, Samir, I'll come back to you, Dr. Jing, in just a moment, if I may. But Samir, it seems to me that the pharmaceutical companies, rather than the national governments who should hold their people's interests at heart, are the ones that have the whip hand here. They're saying we will produce enough for you as long as you don't give us compulsory licensing. In other words, as long as you don't sit on us and flatten us with your regulations, we'll make sure that you're okay. Yeah. But it still doesn't explain to me why the governments don't do this if they have the power to do it, because they don't have to be blackmailed.
Well, I think compulsory licensing, firstly, it's in relation to the TRIPS flexibilities. That's to do with an agreement with all members of the WHO who've agreed to follow and abide by the laws of intellectual property and patents. So this essentially this agreement, this TRIPS agreement, allows for, after 2001, allows for flexibility with government to choose when a medicine is absolutely essential for their healthcare systems. So when that occurs and a government decides that it wants to claim that about a drug, it can then go through this compulsory licensing.
Well, so it can say, let's say, antiretroviral drugs, they would be life-saving, that they are vital.
Yeah.
cancer-treating drugs, etc., but not ones to treat cystic fibrosis, because I've read about that one as well. They are not life-saving. Therefore, you can charge as much as you like for that.
It's not so much it being life-saving; it's how much impact it will have.
Jing, is it the same in the US that the pharma companies have a whip hand over the government, and it's basically a question of doing deals on certain drugs?
Yeah, I suspect the situation is much worse in the US than it is in the UK. For example, we specifically do not allow the federal government to negotiate on behalf of seniors who are enrolled in our Medicare program for lower prescription drug costs. This is something I know that NHS and other highly industrialized countries do, but specifically that was prohibited in the United States through legislation. And so this issue about compulsory licensing, yes, the U.S. is member to this World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, and clearly it is well articulated that member states retain the ability to issue compulsory licenses, especially in public health emergencies, in order for them to acquire enough medicines at a low enough cost to treat their population. I don't believe that the U.S. has ever issued a compulsory license with respect to medicines. They have threatened to do so in the past. And the way I see it, a compulsory license is something that each and every government has the ability to use because of the fact that patents are issued by the government, and what the government can issue, the government can take it away.
Yeah, I've got just a couple of points I wanted to interject on. The first one was just to say that it's up to national governments to define the circumstances in which they want to use a compulsory license. That's what's in the TRIPS agreement. And the second point I wanted to make was just to respond to that question, why hasn't compulsory licensing been used in the UK context? And I just wanted to say that for countries that have used compulsory licensing, they face a lot of bullying and threats by big pharmaceutical companies.
I'm sorry, I don't understand why the law doesn't intervene in this case. We're talking about bullying, we talk about threats, we talk about blackmail, we talk about excessive profits. How will countries want to stay on the right side of big pharma because they've been able to purchase just enough? Why doesn't the law step in here, particularly when lives are at stake?
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, to be honest, because I feel like this whole the whole situation, all the power dynamics are on the side of the big pharmaceutical companies. And if you look in the UK context, certainly there's a real issue around big pharma being very close to the government. They are on the same committees. They're in they have unlimited access. They have a lot of influence in the UK government. And there is also a revolving doors issue as well in terms of pharmaceutical executives moving into government and vice versa. And I think that one of the exciting things about Corbyn's announcement is that they want to exert more public control over medicines.
Jay, would you say the bottom of the list when it comes to interests in terms of health is the patient, it appears to me here?
Yeah, I mean, the patient is the one that kind of suffers in all of this. And we sometimes look at it as if the taxpayers are really upset about the situation. But at the end of it, a patient has a disease and needs a treatment or supporting therapies to treat the particular disease. And the problem comes in with diseases and products that are high priced and offer a very low volume. And that's where the problem comes in. And there are two types of problems. One is when a product is of a high price for rare diseases, as you mentioned, cystic fibrosis, or a niche cancer where you don't necessarily get a high volume of patients who need the particular treatment. The other side of the problem comes in when pharmaceutical companies are leaving the market for the situation of antibiotics, because those products are so cheaply offered on the market that they're not lucrative enough for the pharmaceutical industry. So you've got now the issue of low price pharmaceutical products like antibiotics, where companies are leaving the market, and you have high price medicines where they're so expensive that no one's able to afford it, or even willing to afford it, or able to afford it.
And we're assuming in all of this, aren't we, that the generics, the rip-offs are just as effective as the drugs made by the big pharmaceutical companies. I don't know whether any of you would disagree with that. If you do, please say so now. Okay, Dr. Jing.
No, what was your question? Whether I agree or disagree?
Are we right in assuming that the generic drugs, the rip-off drugs, as I referred to them, the ones that are made for a couple of cents here or there, are as effective as the drugs that they are imitating?
Oh, yeah, I'm a big fan of generics.
Okay, so if they are as effective, and if it is in the
I-
patient's interests, and if governments could nationalize this business, it is simply down to the strong arming of the pharmaceutical companies. Would it be possible for a government to take over this production and keep its patients illness-free, if you like, at a very low cost? Dr. Jing will put that one all the way around the table. You first.
Your question is whether the government can create a public manufacturing company?
Which is exactly what the leader of the Labour Party here in the UK wants to do. Is it practicable?
Probably, yeah. I mean, there are probably enough, former pharmaceutical manufacturer campuses that the government could buy one of them and start to produce a certain number of high-need medicines that are deemed to be of very high value to the population.
But if it does that, then Big Pharma is going to turn around and say, look, now you're taking all of our profits. We're not going to go and make any other drugs. So there, yah-boo.
Yeah, I doubt that. I doubt they would just all of a sudden pick up and move into the tech industry.
Okay.
I think they're going to stay true to their bread and butter and keep making innovative medicines.
Samir.
Yeah, I think it's completely practicable. I mean, you can, of course, build a facility that's going to produce generics, but just for definition, a generic is exactly the same as the starting molecule, the starting drug that a company has made. And it has to be the same for it to get marketed. It's just off patent, so you don't have to worry about the legality of breaking a patent. You can just produce whatever was invented and created first. So Corbyn says that we could build facilities that build these drugs or manufacture these drugs, which is fine, but I don't really see the point, because across the globe you have facilities that do that, there are companies across the world that do that. And when these generics that are produced from these other facilities come onto the market, they will naturally bring down the costs of drugs which have traditionally been more expensive as they're on patent. So it doesn't really add anything new to the mix for me by building facilities that make generics, because essentially there is quite a lot of manufacturing capability globally that does that anyway and will bring down the cost.
But not for every drug. If you identify those that were most needed that aren't being made elsewhere.
That's true. You could have a say in essentially what is manufactured, but I think most successful drugs will have a generic, once they're off patent, a generic company that manufactures generics will certainly be interested in manufacturing those. So you will probably be able to find one which is very, very good and is useful for healthcare systems.
Do you think, Heidi, we're ever going to see a time when Big Pharma is no longer coming in for criticism? It is simply being praised for its wonderful work in producing life-saving materials rather than obscene profits?
I think that they're probably, the range of reforms that Corbyn's talked about, I think will go a long way to reforming the failings that we're seeing in the current sector. I think that, there needs to be more public control over medicines, about what gets produced, who gets those medicines. I think that there is a need for a public manufacturer, generics manufacturer, because just earlier this year, the Department of Health issued a list of 80 different drugs that we're facing shortages with. And on that list of 80 drugs were really essential stuff like naproxen, which is an anti-inflammatory drug, drugs for depression. And so actually there are certain drugs which the pharmaceutical industry just aren't interested in because it just won't make enough profit for them. And
so they don't make them because they're being made elsewhere very cheaply. The cheap ones are then being brought into the UK in some instances, but the government...
So no, what I'm saying is that the pharmaceutical industry aren't even making those drugs.
Not even making.
Yeah, they're just, and so there are maybe only one manufacturer out there, and so there are kind of severe shortages or there are supply problems in getting the kind of the ingredients. But I think I think that the package of reforms that we're seeing, I think, will go a long way, and it's probably been the first time that a political party has wanted to take on this issue, because you are taking in a very powerful vested interest.
I'm going to ask you, you're keen on the idea, that is, if we have a Labour government in this country, we may not have a Labour government. Yeah. Will any other government think it's quite a good idea when they've heard the argument put forward and effectively steal the idea in the way that the drug...
There was already public ownership of pharmaceuticals in countries like China, Brazil, Thailand, the Canadian government.
But I mean, will a Conservative UK government think this is a good idea?
I hope they will.
Okay, Jay, final word if you don't mind.
Yeah. So this has actually been tested and tried in a few countries. So Hindustan Antibiotics was set up by WHO and UNICEF. Around the 50s, they started producing erythropoietin, which was in low supplies in their country. And they've run into major problems in the financial status of the company itself in order to maintain the production facilities. Where it has been successful is a country like in Brazil, where Oswald Cruz Foundation is a state-owned pharmaceutical manufacturing plant that also has research and development capacities. And they've been successful specifically because they also license in potential innovative candidates from biotech companies. So they fulfill a part of this pharmaceutical supply chain so that more products are coming in. So I find that the chance of success are relatively high if you think of a good portfolio, if there's a way to support innovation, if there's enough capital cost to set up the pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in the first place. And that makes a big difference. But there are alternatives like voluntary licensing, in helping this kind of negotiation in order to make sure that high-priced medicines are no longer the situation for patients.
Much appreciated. Jay, thank you very much indeed. And I know that the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation is right behind you, and each one of you is keeping an eye on what's happening and making sure that somebody somewhere, one hopes, is held to account for all the best reasons, saving lives. Thank you very much for taking part in this program. Thank you for watching. For me, David Foster. Until next time, goodbye.